The hull groaned beneath 50 meters of dark Atlantic water. Two German divers descended through the murky silence, their flashlight beams cutting through suspended particles and revealing something that defied everything they thought they knew about American engineering. Before them lay the twisted remains of a Liberty ship, struck not once, not twice, but multiple times by torpedoes during the height of the Battle of the Atlantic. Yet, there it was, resting on the seabed with most of its hull intact, the welded seams holding firm even in death. One of the divers ran his gloved hand along the steel plates, feeling the unbroken welds that stretched the entire length of the vessel. He turned to his partner, and through his diving mask, his eyes betrayed a mixture of disbelief and grudging admiration. The Americans had done something no one thought possible. They had built ships faster than U-boats could sink them, and they had built them to last. If you are fascinated by the untold stories of the Second World War, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and comment below where you are watching from. Your support helps bring these forgotten chapters of history to a wider audience. The story of the Liberty ship began not in the steel mills of Pennsylvania or the shipyards of California, but in the desperate corridors of power in wartime Britain. By the autumn of 1940, German U-boats were strangling the island nation. Every week brought fresh reports of merchant vessels torn apart by torpedoes, their cargoes of food, fuel, and munitions scattered across the ocean floor. Winston Churchill himself would later admit that the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat menace. Britain was bleeding tonnage faster than its shipyards could replace it, and without a dramatic intervention, the island would be starved into submission within months. The British Admiralty turned its attention across the Atlantic. American shipyards had capacity, American steel mills had resources, and American workers had potential, even if they lacked experience in traditional shipbuilding. In September 1940, a technical merchant shipbuilding mission set sail from Liverpool aboard the Scythia. The delegation was led by Robert C. Thompson, the managing director of Joseph L. Thompson and Sons, a venerable shipbuilding firm in Sunderland that had been constructing vessels for decades. Thompson carried with him blueprints for a simple cargo vessel, a design based on a humble tramp steamer called the Dorrington Court. It was nothing revolutionary, just a reliable workhorse capable of carrying 10,000 tons of cargo across the ocean at 11 knots. But in the hands of American industry, this modest design would become something extraordinary. The British mission arrived in New York in early October and immediately encountered skepticism. American shipbuilders looked at the plans with barely concealed disdain. The design called for a triple expansion steam engine, technology that American engineers considered obsolete, a relic from the previous century. The Americans had moved on to steam turbines and diesel engines. They questioned why anyone would build something so primitive when superior technology existed. But the British had practical reasons. Triple expansion engines were simple, reliable, and could be manufactured by companies that had never built marine propulsion before. They required less precision machining than turbines and could be repaired by engineers without specialized training. In wartime, simplicity was not a weakness, but a strength. What the Americans did understand was scale. The Todd Shipyards Consortium, working with a group of West Coast contractors led by a man named Henry J. Kaiser, agreed to build 60 vessels for British account, but they demanded changes to the design. The most significant modification was the substitution of welding for riveting. Traditional shipbuilding relied on thousands of rivets to hold steel plates together, each one requiring skilled workers to heat, position, and hammer into place. A single Liberty ship would need over 1 million rivets if built the old way, and there simply were not enough trained riveters in the entire country to sustain the production rates the war demanded. Welding changed everything. Instead of drilling holes and hammering metal pegs, Workers could fuse steel plates together using electric arcs. The process was faster, required less specialized skill, and produced hulls that were actually lighter than riveted ones because there was no overlap of plates needed to accommodate the rivets. A welded seam was effectively a continuous sheet of steel, unbroken from bow to stern. The British observed this transformation with a mixture of fascination and concern. Welded ships had never been built in such numbers before. No one knew for certain how they would perform under the stress of Atlantic gales and the concussive force of nearby depth charges and explosions. The first American-built ship for British account, the Ocean Vanguard, slid down the ways at Richmond, California on August 16, 1941. Her keel had been laid just 4 months earlier. The speed was remarkable, but it was only the beginning. As American yards refined their techniques and workers gained experience, construction times plummeted. The median time to build a Liberty ship dropped from 230 days to just 39 days by 1943. In one famous publicity stunt, the SS Robert E. Peary was launched just 4 days and 15.5 hours after her keel was laid. While this was not a typical production time, it demonstrated what American industry could achieve when fully mobilized. The transformation of the American workforce was perhaps as remarkable as the ships themselves. Before the war, shipbuilding was a craft dominated by men who had spent years learning their trade. The new welded construction techniques opened the doors to workers who had never set foot in a shipyard. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, earning the nickname Rosie the Riveter, though in truth most of them were wielders, not riveters. At the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, workers who had been farmers, shopkeepers, and housewives just months before were now assembling ships that would carry the arsenal of democracy across the ocean. The yard employed a revolutionary approach, prefabricating large sections of the ship away from the building ways and then lifting them into place with massive cranes. This assembly line method, borrowed from automobile manufacturing, allowed multiple ships to be under construction simultaneously. By 1943, American shipyards were launching 3 Liberty ships every single day. The numbers were staggering. 18 shipyards along the Atlantic, Pacific, and Gulf coasts churned out vessels in quantities that defied comprehension. Between 1941 and 1945, 2,710 Liberty ships entered service. Each one was 441 feet long, capable of carrying 10,000 long tons of cargo, and powered by that same simple triple expansion engine the Americans had initially mocked. Together, they formed the largest fleet of identical vessels ever built in human history. The Germans watched this industrial miracle with growing alarm. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, had staked his strategy on sinking merchant ships faster than the Allies could replace them. His submarines had achieved terrifying success in the early years of the war. In 1942 alone, U-boats sent over 6 million tons of Allied shipping to the bottom. But the Liberty ships kept coming. For every vessel the U-boats destroyed, 3 more slid down the ways. The mathematics of attrition, which had favored Germany for years, began to shift inexorably against them. German naval intelligence struggled to understand how the Americans had achieved such production rates. Captured documents and interrogated sailors provided some answers, but the full picture remained elusive until German forces had the opportunity to examine these vessels firsthand. When Kriegsmarine engineers inspected Liberty ship construction and design, they encountered something that challenged their preconceptions about American manufacturing. The Germans had long believed that their engineering was superior, their craftsmanship more precise, their attention to detail more thorough. What they found in the Liberty ships was something different, not the elegant precision of German engineering, but a brutal efficiency that sacrificed refinement for sheer volume. The welded hulls were particularly impressive. German naval architects had been skeptical of welding for hull construction, preferring the traditional riveted method that allowed ships to flex and absorb stress without catastrophic failure. A riveted hull was essentially a collection of overlapping plates, each one somewhat independent of its neighbors. If a crack developed in one plate, it would stop at the edge of that plate, prevented from spreading by the physical gap where the rivets joined the next section. A welded hull offered no such protection. A crack in a welded structure could theoretically propagate through the entire length of the ship without interruption. And yet, when German divers examined sunken Liberty ships, they found something unexpected. Despite sustaining damage that should have torn them apart, many of these vessels remained remarkably intact. The welded seams held with a tenacity that defied expectations. Part of the explanation lay in the modifications made after the early problems became apparent. When Liberty ships first entered service, some did experience catastrophic failures. Nearly 1,500 instances of significant brittle fracture were recorded during the war, and 12 ships actually broke completely in half, sometimes in calm seas without any enemy action at all. The problem was not the welds themselves, but the steel and the design of the hull. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a British metallurgist named Constance Tipper, working at Cambridge University. Tipper demonstrated that the fractures did not originate in the welds, as many had assumed, but in the steel itself. The mild carbon steel used in Liberty ship hulls underwent a dramatic transformation at low temperatures. Above a certain threshold, the steel was ductile, able to flex and absorb energy without breaking. Below that threshold, it became brittle, prone to sudden catastrophic failure, like glass shattering under impact. This ductile to brittle transition temperature varied depending on the specific composition of the steel, but for many Liberty ships, it was disturbingly high, sometimes above freezing. In the frigid waters of the North Atlantic, the hulls were operating below their safe temperature range. The problems were compounded by stress concentrations in the original design. The square corners of cargo hatches created points where stress accumulated, and these points often coincided with welded seams. When the temperature dropped low enough to make the steel brittle, cracks would nucleate at these stress concentrators and then race through the continuous welded structure at terrifying speed. Sailors reported hearing loud banging sounds as the cracks propagated, each bang representing the failure of another section of hull. In some cases, the entire process took only seconds, leaving crews no time to react. The response was swift and practical. Engineers redesigned the hatch corners, replacing sharp 90-degree angles with rounded openings that dispersed stress more evenly. They added steel straps at critical points along the deck, crack arresters that would stop propagating fractures before they could extend the full length of the ship. Most importantly, they instituted mandatory impact testing for all ship steel. Every batch of steel had to pass Charpy tests at low temperatures before it could be approved for hull construction. These tests were simple enough to run in shipyards, fast enough not to slow production significantly, and accurate enough to catch problem steel before it could be installed in a hull. If you are still with us, take a moment to leave a like on this video. It helps the channel grow and ensures more stories like this one reach a wider audience. The modifications worked. Ships built after 1943 with the improved steel and reinforced hatches proved remarkably durable. They crossed the Atlantic in winter storms, weathered depth-charge attacks that exploded close enough to buckle bulkheads, and survived torpedo strikes that would have sunk lesser vessels. The continuous welded hull, once feared as a structural weakness, revealed itself as a potential advantage. Because the plates were fused together rather than merely bolted, the hull acted as a single unit, distributing stress across a larger area and resisting the localized failures that could sink a riveted ship. The combat performance of Liberty ships astounded even their builders. On September 27, 1942, the SS Stephen Hopkins encountered the German commerce raider Steyr and her tender Tannenfels in the South Atlantic. The Stephen Hopkins was armed with a single 4-inch gun and a pair of 37-millimeter weapons, nothing compared to the firepower of the German raider. Ordered to stop and surrender, the Liberty ship instead opened fire. What followed was one of the most remarkable naval engagements of the war. Outgunned and outmatched, the crew of the Stephen Hopkins fought back with everything they had. As the armed guard crew fell, merchant sailors took their places at the guns. The 4-inch gun crew was wiped out 3 times and replaced 3 times. In the end, both ships were ablaze and sinking, but the Stephen Hopkins had achieved something unprecedented. The humble cargo ship, designed for a 5-year lifespan and never intended for combat, had destroyed a German surface combatant. She became the first and only American merchant ship to sink a German warship in a surface action during the entire war. The German assessment of Liberty ships evolved as the war progressed. Early contempt gave way to grudging respect. The vessels were not elegant. They were not fast. Their engines were a century out of date, and their appointments were Spartan at best. But they were effective. They carried the tanks, the trucks, the ammunition, the fuel, and the food that kept the Allied war machine running. A single Liberty ship could transport enough supplies to equip and feed an entire infantry battalion for months. Multiply that by nearly 3,000 ships, and the scale of the logistical achievement becomes clear. German submariners grew frustrated as their kill rates failed to keep pace with American production. U-boat commanders, who had once boasted of easy kills, found themselves facing ever-improving convoy defenses and an endless stream of replacement vessels. For every Liberty ship they managed to send to the bottom, 3 more appeared on the horizon. The psychological impact was profound. German sailors began to realize that they were not winning a war of attrition, but losing one. No matter how many ships they sank, the Americans would build more. The industrial capacity of the United States, fully mobilized and focused on a single goal, was simply overwhelming. The Kriegsmarine conducted detailed analyses of captured and sunken Liberty ships, documenting their construction methods and material specifications. German engineers noted the extensive use of welding, the prefabricated assembly techniques, and the standardization that allowed components from different factories to be used interchangeably. They admired the efficiency, even as they recognized its implications. Germany could never match this production capacity. The country lacked the steel, the shipyards, and the workforce to build vessels at anything approaching American rates. Every Liberty ship that crossed the Atlantic was a reminder of this fundamental disparity. The examination of sunken vessels proved particularly illuminating. German divers who explored Liberty shipwrecks expected to find hulls torn apart by their torpedoes, evidence of the devastating effectiveness of German weapons. What they often found instead was ships that had gone down largely intact, their welded hulls holding together despite catastrophic flooding. The compartmentalization of Liberty ships, with watertight bulkheads dividing the hull into separate sections, meant that even a torpedo strike would not necessarily sink the vessel immediately. Many Liberty ships absorbed multiple hits and remained afloat long enough for their crews to be rescued or for damage control parties to stabilize the flooding. One German naval officer, reviewing the reports from diving inspections, reportedly commented that the American welding was nearly unbreakable. This was not entirely accurate in a technical sense, as the early brittle fracture problems demonstrated, but it captured something true about the evolved Liberty ship design. The hulls were remarkably robust once the steel quality issues were resolved. They could withstand stresses that would have torn a riveted ship apart, and they maintained their structural integrity even when damaged in ways that should have been fatal. The durability extended beyond combat damage. Liberty ships proved capable of surviving accidents and mishaps that would have ended the careers of more delicate vessels. Ships ran aground, collided with other vessels, and weathered storms that exceeded their design specifications. Many emerged from these ordeals battered but functional, their welded hulls bent but unbroken. The simple triple expansion engines proved equally resilient, continuing to operate even when other systems failed. Sailors who had initially complained about the primitive machinery came to appreciate its reliability. A Liberty ship engine might not be elegant, but it would keep running when more sophisticated power plants failed. The human element of this story is often overlooked in discussions of industrial production and naval strategy. The Liberty ships were built by millions of workers, most of whom had never been inside a shipyard before the war. They were operated by merchant mariners who faced the U-boat threat without the protection of naval status. Merchant sailors were not prisoners of war if captured. They were technically civilians, and many U-boat commanders treated them accordingly, sometimes refusing to rescue survivors or even machine-gunning lifeboats. The mortality rate for American merchant mariners was higher than for any branch of the armed services except the Marine Corps. The ships themselves became communities. A typical Liberty ship carried a crew of about 44 merchant mariners, plus a naval armed guard detachment that could number over 20 men. They lived together in close quarters for weeks at a time, sharing meals in the mess hall, standing watches around the clock, and depending on each other for survival. The midship deckhouse contained all the crew accommodations, a design choice made by the Maritime Commission because it was considered safer for open ocean passages. It also meant that the entire crew lived together, officers and enlisted men separated only by a few bulkheads. The experience of sailing a Liberty ship was unlike anything in peacetime maritime service. The convoys moved slowly, limited by the speed of the slowest vessel, which was often a Liberty ship chugging along at 10 knots. Crossing the Atlantic could take 2 weeks or more, 2 weeks of constant vigilance against submarine attack, 2 weeks of watching the horizon for periscopes and torpedo wakes, 2 weeks of wondering if this voyage would be their last. The stress was immense, but so was the sense of purpose. Every ton of cargo delivered was a contribution to victory, a tangible impact on the course of the war. The post-war fate of the Liberty ships reflected their wartime value. More than 2,400 vessels survived the conflict, far more than anyone had expected when the emergency program began. The ships were supposed to last 5 years at most, just long enough to win the war. Instead, many continued sailing for decades. Greek shipping magnates like Aristotle Onassis and Stavros Niarchos built their fortunes on fleets of surplus Liberty ships purchased cheaply from the American government. Italian families like the Loro and Grimaldi clans did the same. The ugly ducklings of 1941 became the workhorses of the post-war merchant marine. Some Liberty ships met unusual ends. The SS Richard Montgomery sank in the Thames estuary in 1944, still loaded with 1,400 tons of explosives. Her masts remain visible above the water to this day, and the cargo is considered too dangerous to disturb. The wreck is marked on all navigational charts, and an exclusion zone prevents vessels from approaching too closely. If the ammunition ever detonated, the explosion would be equivalent to a small nuclear weapon. British authorities monitor the site regularly, watching for signs of hull deterioration that might trigger the catastrophe that has been waiting for over 80 years. The SS Grand Camp, originally christened the Benjamin R. Curtis, met its end in Texas City Harbor on April 16, 1947. A fire broke out while the ship was loading ammonium nitrate fertilizer, and despite firefighting efforts, the cargo detonated with catastrophic results. The explosion killed at least 581 people, injured thousands more, and destroyed much of the industrial waterfront. It remains one of the deadliest industrial accidents in American history, a reminder that the same ships that had survived torpedoes and storms could be destroyed by cargo that seemed mundane compared to weapons of war. 2 Liberty ships survive in operational condition today. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien is moored at Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco, carefully maintained in her original 1943 configuration. She participated in the Normandy landings and returned to France for the 50th anniversary of D-Day in 1994, the only large vessel from the original fleet to make the commemorative voyage. The SS John W. Brown is based in Baltimore, serving as both a museum ship and an active memorial. Both vessels put to sea regularly, their 70-year-old engines still churning away, testament to the durability of the design that American engineers had initially dismissed as obsolete. The legacy of the Liberty ship extends far beyond the vessels themselves. The mass production techniques developed in American shipyards during the war influenced manufacturing across industries. The concept of prefabrication, building components off-site and assembling them at the final location, became standard practice in construction and heavy industry. The emphasis on standardization and interchangeability, already familiar from automobile production, was elevated to new levels. Workers who had mastered welding in the shipyards carried their skills into peacetime careers in construction, pipeline work, and fabrication. The scientific understanding gained from Liberty ship failures proved equally valuable. Constance Tipper's work on brittle fracture laid the foundation for the modern discipline of fracture mechanics. Engineers learned to consider not just the strength of materials but their behavior under different conditions of temperature and stress. The concept of the ductile to brittle transition temperature became fundamental to structural engineering, influencing the design of everything from bridges to pipelines to aircraft. The Liberty ship failures, tragic as they were at the time, ultimately saved countless lives by revealing the hidden dangers in materials that seemed perfectly adequate under normal conditions. The German assessment of Liberty ships evolved over time as well. Immediately after the war, German naval officers were eager to attribute their defeat to factors beyond their control: the overwhelming industrial might of America, the entry of the Soviet Union, the strategic mistakes of Hitler. The Liberty ship became a symbol of that industrial superiority, proof that even the best submarines could not overcome an enemy capable of building ships faster than they could be sunk. Later, historians have complicated this narrative, noting that the U-boats were ultimately defeated, not just by numbers, but by improved tactics, better technology, and the breaking of German codes. But the Liberty ships played a crucial role in buying time for those improvements to take effect. The examination of sunken Liberty ships continued long after the war ended. Divers explored wrecks scattered across the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Mediterranean, documenting the condition of hulls that had been underwater for decades. What they found consistently impressed even skeptical observers. The welded seams, once considered a potential weakness, had proven remarkably durable. Ships that had been torpedoed, bombed, and depth-charged remained substantially intact on the seafloor. The steel had corroded, certainly, but the fundamental structure endured. One German diver who had served in U-boats during the war and later became an underwater archaeologist reportedly expressed amazement at how well the hulls had held up. He had spent years trying to destroy these ships, and here they were, decades later, still recognizable, still largely whole. The psychological impact on German veterans was significant. Many U-boat men had believed during the war that they were engaged in a winnable struggle, that if they could just sink enough ships, they could strangle Britain and force the Allies to sue for peace. The reality, which became clear only after the war, was that they never had a chance. American industrial capacity was simply too vast. The Liberty ship program alone produced more tonnage than the entire German merchant fleet at the start of the war. Add in the Victory ships, the T-2 tankers, and the thousands of other vessels built during the conflict, and the disparity becomes overwhelming. Germany was fighting a 20th century naval war against an enemy with 21st century production capabilities. The story of the Liberty ship is ultimately a story about the transformation of industrial warfare. Before the Second World War, Naval power was measured in capital ships, battleships, and aircraft carriers whose construction required years of work by skilled craftsmen. The Liberty ship represented a different approach, the application of mass production techniques, to a domain that had previously resisted them. The ships were not beautiful. They were not fast. They were not technologically advanced. But they could be built in quantities that no enemy could match, and they could do the one thing that mattered most. They could carry cargo across oceans in the face of determined opposition. The German divers who examined those sunken hulls were witnessing the physical evidence of a revolution. The welded plates beneath their hands represented not just a different method of construction, but a different philosophy of warfare. The Americans had understood something that their enemies had missed. In a global conflict of attrition, the winner would not be the nation with the best weapons, but the nation that could produce the most weapons. The Liberty ship was the embodiment of that insight, a weapon system designed not for peak performance, but for maximum production, and in the end, production won. The waters of the Atlantic still hold the remains of hundreds of Liberty ships, their hulls serving as artificial reefs and underwater monuments to the largest shipbuilding program in history. Fish swim through holds that once carried Sherman tanks and ammunition crates. Coral encrusts deck machinery that was forged in the steel mills of Pennsylvania and Ohio. The ships that were built to last 5 years have endured for generations, their welded seams holding firm against the pressure of the deep and the relentless corrosion of salt water. They are time capsules, frozen moments of industrial and military history, reminders of a time when the outcome of the greatest war in human history depended on the unglamorous work of building and sailing cargo ships. If you have made it this far, you truly appreciate the depth and detail of historical storytelling. Please subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the forgotten stories of military history. Share this video with friends who appreciate the intersection of engineering and warfare. And most importantly, take a moment to reflect on the millions of workers and sailors who built and crewed these vessels, ordinary people who performed extraordinary feats during the darkest hours of the 20th century. The Liberty ships were their creation, and their legacy endures beneath the waves of every ocean they sailed.